Welcome everyone to Prosecutors Center for Excellence video blog series. My name is Kristine Hamman. I'm the Executive Director of Prosecutors Center for Excellence, PCE. I'm joined by Sophia Roach, Senior Attorney with PCE, and we're so pleased to be joined by Chalfin.
Welcome everyone to our national video blog. We are excited today to have Assistant Professor of Criminology, Chalfin from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Chalfin has been doing his research largely on the costs and benefits of investing in policing. And with regard to that, he's going to talk to us a little bit today about a study he conducted on precision policing, another form of data-driven law enforcement, and its effectiveness on reducing violence. So with that, Professor Chalfin, I give you the floor.
All right, thanks so much for inviting me to speak as part of the series. So I'm just gonna share my screen. So yeah, thanks again for having me. This is a project I'm very excited about because I think it provides a roadmap, or at least maybe proof of concept for how law enforcement can make progress in reducing violence without subjecting disadvantaged communities to some of the costs that are associated with excessive policing. And so this research that I'll tell you about today is going to be motivated by the story of a particular city that found a way to reduce its homicide rate by 50%. At a time when homicides were flat nationally. And so the city is going to be New York City. I'm going to talk about what happened in New York when a federal judge issued a ruling that forced the city's police department to move away from a policing regime that relied heavily on the widespread use of street stops and arrests. And so pretty much overnight, the police lost the means to apply what had been previously thought to be a critical tool in maintaining public safety in the city. And so many people feared that this court ruling was going to lead to a new rise in crime. But instead, the opposite happened. And really there's a shift in strategy that ushered in what, looking back, really feels like it was a golden age in public safety that lasted for a decade in New York, leading up to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I might simply be stating the obvious here, but policing carries with it both costs and benefits. There's a lot of research literature on this, that shows that investments in policing usually reduces crime, including serious violence like homicide. So crime does go down in response to greater police presence. I know that's not always been a popular message, but it's definitely a strong consensus in the research literature. And crime declines when you hire more police officers. So one recent estimate is that for every 10 police officers hired in the United States, you abate one murder annually. So law enforcement works, but in its simplest form, you might think of it as a blunt tool. Every interaction between a police officer and a citizen carries with it some risk, both for the citizen and for the officer. And when cities hire more police, those officers do end up making more arrests, particularly more low quality, sort of low level, let's say, quality of life arrests for minor crimes that often don't have a clear victim. And so while arresting people for low level crimes is intended to make communities safer and more orderly, the evidence really doesn't suggest that prosecuting people for these types of crimes and is leading to large improvements in public safety, maybe sort of more around the edges. You also have police facing a perpetual legitimacy crisis in communities around the country and really around the world. So people worry that disadvantaged communities end up being both over-policed and also underprotected. And that's really the big problem that police agencies and also prosecutors' offices need to solve, moving forward. And so I think a natural question here is, can we have the benefits of law enforcement without as many of the costs? And maybe that's too much to hope for, right? And I think there's some reasons to be pessimistic because there's always trade-offs in the world, right? Even when efficiency gains are theoretically feasible, there's always political constraints, there's operational challenges that get in the way of progress. And I think fundamental change is just hard. And so I think any reasonable observer of this policy domain, I certainly wouldn't blame that person for being a pessimist. But this is not going to be a dismal talk. This is going to be an optimistic talk because I really think there are some reasons to be optimistic. And those reasons are going to be pretty instrumental in motivating the research that I'm going to explain today. And so let me just give some reasons for optimism here. So first, crime is just very concentrated among a small number of people and places. So in cities around the world, about 5% of blocks account for half of the violent crimes. And obviously, prosecutors know this, a very small share of the population accounts for a very large share of the crime. And in particularly, that's true of serious violence. And it suggests then that something surgical, might just work, right? It's something that you can really target well and have maybe a very big impact. So second, there's some new evidence that suggests that large numbers of street stops and arrests, don't actually have a big impact on public safety. So I'll give a New York specific example. When the number of stops in an area goes up because there's a new police precinct captain in that area, violence doesn't really change, right? So nationally, when police activity drops and, in the aftermath of some event, like a shooting of a police officer, we don't really see that crime is responding. And that's also good news because it suggests that something surgical might work, that you don't need the constant large numbers of stops and the large numbers of arrests, that maybe it's just a matter of making the right stops and the right arrests. So ultimately, can police meaningfully reduce the serious violence while minimizing the harms, of law enforcement to disadvantaged communities? Another way to sort of state this is what happens when the police shift away of a policy from a policy of mass enforcement to something that is more surgical, that I'll refer to as precision policing, but it's really just precision law enforcement, right? Because there's a policing component to this. There's also certainly a prosecutorial component to this. Okay. So I'm going to return now to New York City. I'm going to answer some of these questions in the context of a particular intervention that I think is informative. And so our research focuses on coordinated gang raids in and around New York City public housing communities, which is a strategy that the police began to pursue when they couldn't rely any longer on this mass stop, question, frisk regime because federal courts said that they couldn't do that anymore. So we're going to study what happens to serious violence in these communities after a gang raid, which colloquially in the city are referred to as gang takedowns. That's obviously not a technical term, but I kind of like the term because I think it's pretty descriptive. So let me just sort of say a little bit about these gang takedowns, and I'll say something more formally in a few minutes. The gang takedowns are sometimes a little messy, but it is a strategy that is much more precise than the regime that preceded it. As I'll show, the gang takedowns did reduce serious gun violence, shootings by around a third. It didn't involve making more arrests down the line for low-level offenses. It didn't involve more street stops. And really critically, it didn't address any of the root causes of violence. So I think there's this view that some people have that in order to make progress in reducing violence, we have to reduce, we have to confront these root causes. And I think history suggests that that's not true. I mean, it would be great to address the root causes. It's certainly very important. It's a generational challenge, but we've seen crime, go way up and go way down in our lifetimes without any meaningful change in the root causes. And I think that suggests that law enforcement and policy in general can play an important role. Okay. So this is my favorite New Yorker cartoon. I'm a native New Yorker, so I couldn't resist the impulse to use this slide. So the setting for this intervention is New York City. And I'll just motivate the research by providing some of the background, the politics of crime policy in the city over the last couple of years. This might be old hat for New Yorkers listening in, but maybe for everyone else, there'll be at least something that's not widely known. But I'll start with the one thing that is widely known, which is that New York City is certainly been seen as the poster child for America's quote unquote great crime decline of the 1990s. And so from 1990 to 1999, homicides fell by something like 45% nationally. They fell by 70% in New York City. So by the end of the 1990s, New York City had a homicide rate that was, barely above the national average, and it had been 5 times the national average back in 1990 when the decade began. So homicides began to fall after 1999. The rate of change became much slower. It began to level off. And so if we fast forward to 2011, this is just before the city really starts to shift policy dramatically. New York City in 2011 had what I think everyone would have considered to be a banner year. The city had experienced 2,200 homicides, the peak of the crack epidemic in 1990. In 2011, the homicide number was 515. So really a great year looking back historically at it. So in 2011, New York was among the safest large cities in the US at a homicide rate that was around a third that of Chicago, just to give a comparison. And so I think it's right. And I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I think we all agree that this is the consensus. It was widely assumed at that point that pushing the homicide rate down any lower was just going to be pretty difficult to achieve, right? Murders were way down. The city hadn't addressed any of those root causes of violence. New York remained deeply segregated, lots of poverty, lots of social isolation. Illegal handguns are still being trafficked up the I-95 corridor. None of that had changed, right? So, what more could law enforcement really do? And the police department was being very proactive already. In fact, maybe too proactive, right? Depending on your perspective. From 2002 to 2011, the police in New York went from making about 100,000 street stops a year to making more than 700,000. So, a lot of people assumed that crime had been falling, and this strategy of mass stop, question, and frisk had been successful, and maybe had actually been the reason for that falling crime. That was, I think, a common interpretation of the crime numbers at the time. Okay, so fast forward now to August 2011. The city's mass enforcement regime came to an end when a federal judge sent really a very purposeful and powerful signal to the city's political leadership that this policy of mass stop, question, frisk was likely to be illegal and was racially discriminatory. So particular, the signal sent when the judge declines to dismiss a lawsuit filed by several plaintiffs that alleged that NYPD's enforcement activity was discriminatory. The case wouldn't conclude really for another couple of years, but the city got the message back in 2011. So the final ruling isn't issued until 2013, but in 2011, I'm just zooming in on the slide here, you can hopefully see my cursor. You can see that there's this dramatic drop. This is the number of official street stops measured in thousands. You can see there's this just dramatic drop in street stops right around the time when the case is allowed to continue. So if you look for public commentary, the judge's ruling was roundly criticized by Ray Kelly, who was the police commissioner at the time, and by Mayor Mike Bloomberg. You can see the quote on the slide that indicates that the mayor says, this is going to make the city less safe. This is a ruling made by people who don't understand how policing actually works. And so police officials worried, right? And I don't think this was a crazy concern, that without the persistent threat of a street stop, the deterrence value of law enforcement would just plummet, right? Offenders would begin carrying guns again. The police would lose this critical tool in winning control of the city streets, and particularly with respect to gun violence, which is the thing that we all worry about the most. And at the time, those fears were bolstered by academic research that suggested, I don't think correctly, but it did suggest at the time that very intensive order maintenance policing had been effective in curtailing violent crime and might have played a role in the city's 1990s crime decline. I think the evidence for that is weaker than was supposed at the time, but it was there, and I think colored the thinking about this. So, what happened after 2011 was therefore, I think, unexpected by a lot of observers. And this is something that is not widely appreciated. So everyone knows about the 1990s. I think far fewer people know about what happened in the city from 2011 to 2019. So during this period, national rates of homicide were flat, or maybe were actually increasing a little bit. And New York experienced what I've been calling a second great crime decline. And this paper is written to help to try to at least partially explain what happened in New York and didn't happen in other large cities to nearly the same degree during this time period. Here's some evidence for this. So from 2011 to 2019, murders and shootings declined by about 50% in the city. This would look even more dramatic if I'd monkeyed with the axis a little bit, but I decided to be intellectually honest and give you the entire axis. But this is really an incredible decline in homicide and shootings that occurred in a city that already had an incredible decline. And if you look at national trends, this is even more amazing. So the national trend was not to see declining homicides. This is something that really was New York City specific. Just to also provide a little bit of context for what New York ended up looking like at the end of this decade, just prior to the pandemic, New York City had a homicide rate of 3.8 per 100,000 residents, which is really closer to European capitals like London and Paris than even to safe US cities like LA or Boston, let alone the most challenged cities like Baltimore or St. Louis or Detroit. So these are just selected cities here. So that's where we ended up. That's where we ended up. It's a really incredible story, I think. And just to sort of summarize what happened and how public opinion changed, it's a headline from the National Review, which is, of course, one of the most canonical conservative periodicals in the United States. They ran an op-ed, actually New Year's Day in 2018, saying, we were wrong about stop and frisk. And so the question is, what happened? Why did New York experience this second great crime decline on the heels of this, total change in policing strategy that removed what many people thought was a very important tool in the police department's toolkit? So, look, it's always going to be impossible to offer a complete explanation. What I always like to say about research is well designed to study the effects of a particular intervention. It's not well designed to explain why the world looks the way it looks. Like that's like a very, very hard question for anyone to answer, let alone a mere researcher. But I think there are some things that we can say. So some people talk about New York experiencing gentrification, all the hipsters wandering around Williamsburg, Brooklyn, searching for rainbow bagels and all that. But it's really not likely to be gentrification that drove down homicide, because homicides fell in every area of New York City, and especially in some of the most impoverished neighborhoods that had not and still haven't experienced much gentrification. Some people point, and this is related to gentrification, is demographic changes, but demographic changes have actually been very slow. New York City remains an incredibly diverse city, as it has been for many, many years. You would have made that statement in 2011, and you would have made that statement in 2019. That really didn't change. And it's not more police. The size of the police force actually was unchanged over the course of the decade. It's really doesn't seem to be an issue about policing resources or prosecutorial resources or anything like that. But there is one clue that I think is important and was part of what inspired me to want to do this research. So the great crime decline in that decade from 2011 to 2019 in New York is really not a crime decline so much as a decline in homicide and shootings. It's really a decline in gun violence. So for example, if I looked at other crimes, so assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, for most of these, New York is following national trends. Or maybe it's declining a little bit more than other cities, but not by a whole lot. And so that is just this other clue here that it's something that's very specific to homicide. So whatever's happening, it's a homicide specific thing. And in particular, it's been written, a lot of writing's been done about how it's more gang homicide. It's not domestic violence. It's not other types of homicide. It's really the gang homicide that was driving those decreases. Okay, so when federal courts signaled that New York City's approach to policing was unlikely to be constitutional, the city actually changed what it was doing, right? So some people have said, oh, well, stop and frisk was actually causing crime to be high, because then when crime went down when we stopped doing it. But that is, I think, a very naive view of this, because the police department and prosecutors' offices in the city, they're aware of what's going on, and they just shift what they're doing. And so instead of engaging in this mass enforcement regime that nets a lot of people into the criminal justice system, there's a shift to something that's far more surgical. So in 2012, NYPD initiated 2 transformational policies, which signaled a change in how it was going to be doing this, how it was going to be more surgical, how it was going to deal with issues of gang and group and youth violence. So first, the department implemented something called Operation Crew Cut, which is a policy that doubled the number of officers assigned to the NYPD's gang unit. And second, the police commissioner announced the renewal of the department's criminal group database, or just gang database, which was a unified list of alleged gang members throughout the city. So that was remains controversial, but that was part of this signaling that the regime was going to be changing. And importantly, all of this stuff was not just about targeting established criminal enterprises like offshoots of the Bloods, of the Crips, but also loosely affiliated groups of teens who often identify themselves by the blocks where they live and who are responsible for a lot of the violence in cities like New York and obviously other cities too. So gang takedowns were really, the vehicle that drove a lot of this. So, you have a gang database, you have more gang officers, and what are you doing with them? Well, you're doing a lot of stuff. But one of the major things that they did was to focus on particular gangs and groups and figure out, well, how can we, take these groups out and to, make it hard for them to continue their criminal activity. So yeah, let's get into what this means. As I mentioned, it's not a technical or a legal term. It would be a weird legal term if it were. It's a colloquial expression used in media reports and among members of the law enforcement community in the city to describe really these highly coordinated and targeted raids on alleged gang members that often centered, not exclusively, but often centered on the city's public housing communities. So this is a partnership, between the police and the district attorney's offices. It's really a partnership that's about building major cases. And in some ways, it's nothing new. It's not like this was invented in 2011, 2012, and no one had ever thought to do this before, ever, right? It's just a shift in strategy where this became, a central part of what the police and the prosecutors were doing in a way that it hadn't quite been before. So, the way this works is these are conspiracy cases, right? If I were giving this talk to an audience that didn't involve prosecutors, I would explain what that means. I don't think I have to do that. But I'll just say that, look, for some of these gangs that are involved in drug dealing, it's one type of case where you build conspiracy charges using narcotics arrests. In other cases where it's more just about non-instrumental violence, you're going on Facebook, you're befriending people using fake accounts and, building a different sort of conspiracy case, right? So it's really just an umbrella kind of approach. What I think ties this together is the arrests are affected as closely as possible in time, right? It's not like you're picking people off piecemeal. You're making a show of it. 100 police officers massing in a public housing development, arresting 25 people in one fell swoop. So if there's ever a way to maximize the deterrence value of law enforcement, like this was probably it. So it's basically collective punishment of a gang. So there's a lot of these raids. Some are small, some are larger. I'll just note that the 2 largest takedowns occurred in 2014 and 2016, led to over 100 arrests. But there have been a lot of smaller ones as well that have taken place. So they range from a handful of arrests to more than 100, just to give you a sense for the variability in scale. Okay, so just a little bit back to the what the city was doing differently. So on the left-hand side, this is the figure that I've shown previously, the crash in official street stops. And some of this is just poor documentation. Like, I don't think that there's actually only 12,000 stops made in New York City. I think police are not documenting everything, but even when you account for auditing of that number, it's still a gigantic, gigantic decline. So you can see right as that decline's happening, you start to see this ramping up of gang takedowns. And I don't know that I would say that one policy was explicitly created to replace another. But the media noticed. This is a New York Times headline that ran in, I think it was late 2013. You can see the headline, "Frisking Tactic Yields to a Focus on Youth Gangs." So a lot of people who were watching what was happening in law enforcement in New York this time, noticed and did view these things as substitutes for one another. Okay, so as I mentioned, the setting for this research is public housing in New York City. And for those of you who maybe have been to New York and wandered around Times Square and saw Central Park, but didn't go and hang around in public housing, this is what a lot of these communities look like. They're sort of a cluster of high-rise buildings that are inset from the street. There's no commercial activity. They're really just residential communities. They look a little bit like a cluster of college dorms, actually, from bird's eye view. And these are communities that have a lot of challenges. Even though they probably aren't as challenged as the poorest parts of Detroit or Baltimore, they do have an outsized share of crime in New York. They have a lot of poverty. They also tend to be fairly tightly knit. So sometimes people are cycling in and out of public housing, but often people live in these communities for many years, and sometimes it's multiple generations of the same family. So I just say that to provide a little bit of background. And what we do is we identify over 100 gang takedowns that happen within or next to a public housing community. And you can see how this breaks out across the geography of New York City. They're really concentrated in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. Okay, so I wanted to say something about demographics. So when you look at who's arrested as part of the takedowns, I think for a group of prosecutors, the demographics are not going to be surprising. Disproportionately, the arrestees are young Black men. New York's population is maybe 20 to 25% Black, depending on how you count it. The takedown arrestees are 2/3 Black. So, people have definitely pointed to these numbers and said this is evidence of discrimination. You also do need to understand that when you look at homicide victims in the city, I think it's right, that's probably about the same number, about 2/3 are Black. So, this is just something that represents a broader social challenge, right? And social inequality that law enforcement deals with and isn't really situated to solve. So you could either view this as discriminatory or not, I think, depending on your perspective. But I just throw the numbers out there so you can make up your own mind about it. Okay, I'll briefly talk about the research design. I'm going to do this in a non-technical way, but I think it's like kind of intuitively obvious what we're doing. You don't have to be a researcher to understand the research design at all. Simpler research designs are always better. So basically, we have data that spans this time period. We look at the subset of public housing developments that experienced at least one of these gang takedowns. We didn't look at the other developments because they're generally very different. So some of these housing developments are where senior citizens live. There's not a whole lot of crime around them. They're actually pretty safe places. So we're going to focus on the larger developments, the ones that actually were subject to this kind of enforcement activity. And then we're going to look at a 2-year bandwidth around the development's initial gang takedown during this period. So if the takedown occurred in July of 2016, we'll look at the July of 2014 to the July of 2018 period. We do that just to deal with the potential confounding of just other time trends, things that are going on in the city. So the key question for us is whether crime declined or changed in the aftermath of the takedown. And what we're doing is we're leveraging the potentially arbitrary timing of these takedowns. So we're saying, if the takedowns happen for very specific reasons, we might worry that the timing of this isn't arbitrary. And so you might be concerned that that's the case, right? Maybe the city is timing the takedowns to coincide with rising crime in a particular area. In practice, I don't think that that actually was going on, and I can show you some evidence of that shortly. But for now, let me just say this. The takedowns happen only after months or even years of investigation. They happen when all of the legal elements are in place to make the arrests in a legal way. So even if city planners and prosecutors are initiating these takedowns, based on crime and violence, the exact timing of these takedowns really isn't about the crime trends. It's really more about, the legal sufficiency. And so I think that's really important to say. And then when you actually look at the data, when you just look at the patterns, there's not a whole lot of evidence that there's rising or falling crime in these communities relative to other communities that didn't receive a takedown just before a takedown happens. It looks like the timing is actually fairly arbitrary. I'll skip through the egghead researcher details on this, but if there are questions, I'm definitely happy to talk through any of the technical details. I'm sure at least one person who watches this will actually, have a pretty good statistical background and will want to know the details. Always happy to chat about that offline. So let me just sort of say this. Basically, what we do is we compare the places that received a takedown to the places that hadn't received one yet. We account for broader crime trends in the boroughs where these takedowns happened. So if there's broader crime trends that have nothing to do with these public housing developments, we're accounting for that. We're doing a lot of stuff. And no matter what we did, we couldn't make the result go away. And we did a lot. We really did a lot. Okay, so what do we find? So we find, and I've mentioned this, we find large declines in serious violence in the aftermath of one of these takedowns. Here's just a graphical depiction of the results in the paper. There's tons of tables with numbers in them. So after a takedown, we observe 55% decline in homicides and a 33% decline in shootings. These are rare events, even though they're really serious events and we all worry about how high the numbers are, they're rare in statistical terms. And so the homicide result isn't quite what we would call statistically significant, even though it's a really huge number. But the shooting result is. The shooting result is absolutely statistically significant. We don't observe significant declines in less lethal violence. So we don't see declines in robberies. We don't see declines in non-shooting assaults that are particularly large. We see maybe small declines that aren't quite statistically significant. And in many ways, this is exactly what you would expect to see, right? When it comes to gun violence, we know that gangs are huge drivers of that. When it comes to things like robbery and assault, gangs may drive that to a degree, but more people are driving that than just gangs. So I actually view these results as, fully expected, if you buy into the theory of change that these gang takedowns were going to be effective. Okay, and here's the other important thing. And this is really key. This is what made me get really, really excited about this project, that when you think about these large declines in violence, they were not accompanied by a sustained increase in law enforcement activity. So it's not like you have a takedown and then there's a permanent army of police in the area making lots and lots of arrests, right? That's not what happened. In fact, what we see, if anything, is that the communities that get these gang takedowns, in the aftermath of the gang takedowns, there's fewer street stops, there's fewer arrests for misdemeanor marijuana offenses, there's fewer drug possession arrests, right? If anything, it looks like we're seeing things moving, in a good direction with respect to, not roping as many people into the net of the criminal justice system. Because we know when we rope people in for minor charges, it doesn't always make them better. It sometimes makes them more likely to offend because, these kinds of arrests can destroy their human capital. And so that, I think, is really exciting, that law enforcement was a way to, get rid of the most serious crime without just resorting to draconian measures, that had been done a little bit in the past. So you might be wondering, was crime sort of just pushed around the corner? It's funny, that's a concern that comes up when I present to audiences of economists, of academic economists. They always say, oh, was crime pushed around to other neighborhoods? And it's a reasonable fear, I think, but for people who study crime or are on the front lines, working in law enforcement, I think that concern is usually a little bit less exotic because we know how closely crime is tied to place. That people commit crimes where they live, where they're familiar, where they know other people. There is some retaliatory gang violence that can happen in other communities, but so much of it is so local, right? So here's what we do. We do a quantitative analysis to see if crime is pushed around the corner. We don't really see evidence of this. We look in areas that are adjacent to these public housing communities. We also look at nearby public housing developments that didn't receive a gang takedown. If anything, there could be a little bit of evidence that shootings decline in other housing developments that are nearby, which could speak to the fact that there is potentially some retaliatory violence involving multiple housing developments. But overall, we're not really seeing evidence of displacement. These are true crime declines, true shooting declines, not just moving stuff around, which is another reason to be, I think, pretty excited about this. So I guess just to wrap up, because I don't want to take tons and tons of time here, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what I think these results mean for policy and why I think they're exciting, but also some important caveats and limitations that I think are important to bear in mind before we get too excited about something like this. So yeah, just to summarize, we find that these gang takedowns led to large declines in gun violence. Overall, we think that these takedowns explain maybe around 25% of the overall decline in gun violence in these communities. If anything, that's probably a lower bound estimate of the impact of precision policing, because there's lots of other stuff that law enforcement's doing. It's not just the gang takedowns. There's other enforcement actions that probably matter. It's just a more targeted regime in general. So, all this is to say, I think that this thing did matter at scale. It wasn't just, changing things in a small number of communities. It is making an impact citywide. So in terms of making connections to policy, these findings suggest that a surgical form of law enforcement is really a promising avenue, right? It's proof of concept that policing and prosecution can make a serious dent without addressing the root causes, without making lots of arrests. And, maybe this is even something that can improve police legitimacy, right? So I think in the popular media, there's a sense that the reason why we have a legitimacy crisis in policing, and frankly, we've had it for a long time, right? This didn't start with George Floyd. This is something that's written about a lot in the 60s and even earlier than that. A lot of people, I think, suppose that, it's about police violence or police shootings or use of force. But when you talk to people in the community, right, they often will talk about the other side of the coin, which is that they say, well, police aren't doing anything about the violence. They're, arresting my son who's like walking back home from, school or stopping him and harassing him, but they're not arresting the shooters. They're not, getting rid of the bad guys. And so, this is maybe an approach that if it can be operationalized successfully, which is, difficult to do, could have an impact on legitimacy over time. Nothing is likely to have an impact on legitimacy in the extreme short run, given that people have a lifetime of lived experience with this. On the other hand, there are some reasons to be fairly circumspect about these results. So first, the results don't last forever. We observed the treatment effects lasting for 18 months. After a year and a half, it seems like the crime starts to go back to baseline. So it's not, a permanent solution. I think it's fair to say that this is an approach that treats the symptoms and not the disease. Some people would say, so we shouldn't bother doing that. I would say, well, treating the symptoms matters too, even if you can't cure the underlying disease with this. But, it is something to bear in mind that, there's always going to be an uneasy piece, to steal the words of Pat Sharkey, who wrote a wonderful book by that name, talking about how, crime was maybe poised to go up. He wrote this book before it went up in 2020, and it now seems pretty prescient. So gang takedowns are a tool, but they don't solve the problem of having an uneasy piece. There's still costs. So I think the way to describe this, and this is maybe particularly important for this audience, is I would say this is definitely precision policing. It's not so clear that this is always precision prosecution. So there's been advocates, people who are public defenders who said, like, look, a huge number of kids are arrested who are charged with being in a gang. They're charged with being part of a criminal conspiracy. Some of them aren't even gang members. My client wasn't a gang member. My client had left the gang, a year ago and had no further involvement with the gang. Sometimes the charges are dropped. Sometimes the charges are actually based on very minor behavior by a given charged defendant. Like maybe the charged defendant was indicated as selling marijuana, but is still being charged as being part of a broader criminal conspiracy. So I think there's some due process concerns that are important here. It's just sort of highlights some trade-offs that fewer people are being roped into the criminal justice system this way, but the people who are being roped in are being roped into some pretty serious charges that often carry real sentences, not just jail sentences, but sentences in state prison. There's people who've written very compelling essays decrying some of these excesses. Replicability is open. So I've been asked, like, would this work in other cities? And I always say I am but a humble researcher. I don't know. I'd love to study it. If there are people, who are listening to this who have been piloting something like this, or if they've also shifted an approach, I'd love to, take a look at the data and see if there's a way to tease out what's been happening. I think what I'd say is this. One thing that's going to matter is how cohesive these gangs are. I think in the 80s and the 90s, when we started playing around with focused deterrence, like really in the mid 90s for focused deterrence, the theory of change there was that there was a leader of the gang, right? That really could be persuaded, could be deterred, and then that person could then exercise control over people on the street. We see less of that type of violence these days, that the violence tends to be more and more non-instrumental, and you have less of these really sort of strong leaders, more free agents walking around. But look, this was true in New York in the last 10 years, and this effect worked, this treatment worked. And I think one of the reasons was it wasn't just deterrence, that a big part of this was just incapacitation. And incapacitation is, I think, a very compelling intervention. It's one that we don't often talk about, because people see this as a public health problem. But I think the incapacitation effects here probably matter quite a bit. With respect to individual cities, I think, all bets are off. It's not so easy, I think, to build a great relationship between the police and the prosecutor's offices, depending on what regimes are in place. So I won't name the cities, but I can think of a couple cities where those relations are very strained. I think New York, in several of these boroughs, had a moment where there really was a lot of cooperation and mutual respect between police and prosecutors that made the success of this, program of gang takedowns possible. So finally, I can't resist talking about the Wire a little bit, which is now, it's almost 20 years since the show first aired. So this is Al Capone on one hand, and then Marlo Stanfield, a fictional character in The Wire, on the other. And The Wire really, I think, is a TV show that highlights the tremendous benefits of good law enforcement and the tremendous costs of bad law enforcement. The benefits of focusing on building major cases and not sort of, quick rips, right? Designed to just make a show of what law enforcement's doing. And, I sort of think this evaluation of what New York City did in some ways is like the real life version of what, maybe David Simon, wanted from this fictionalized version of the Baltimore Police Department and the state's attorney's office, and frustratingly didn't get right in the plot of the show. If you haven't seen The Wire, I apologize, but highly recommend seeing it. So yeah, so I just think, we at a time when law enforcement, feels to some as creating a lot of problems for poor and disadvantaged communities, it's important to highlight the fact that they also can do a lot of good when they do their job well, a whole lot of good. It's a ton of trauma that comes from gun violence, that people watching this, have seen with their own eyes and talked to victims. And if you can reduce something like that by about a third, I think that's a really, really important finding. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
That was an incredibly thorough presentation, and I do not have any additional questions. I'm not sure if you do, Chris, but what a fascinating study. Really, really interesting to see.
Yeah, I do just have an observation, and I appreciate that you as a criminologist can speak in layman's terms so prosecutors can understand the import of what you've been telling us. But we have heard the term hot people and hot places repeatedly. And that means people and places that are the most dangerous. And I presume that this precision policing focuses on those hot people and hot places. And I presume the bottom line of your research is that once you identify those hot people and hot places, what are you going to do about it? And you have studied, I think, the answer to that. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great characterization. So we know, for example, when we mass police in crime hotspots, on average, crime goes down. Crime is sensitive to the presence of police officers, which is good. But the hot people are the huge drivers of things, even within the hot places, right? And, look, there are efforts to try to peel off some of those hot people with social services. And there's some efforts that have been successful. For those people who can't be peeled off, yeah, the question is, can you incapacitate them, right? And if not incapacitate, then deter others, who might be saying, look, law enforcement is hot. Right now, they're coming in for us. And maybe it's even a way to tamp things down. Like, there's retaliatory violence, but I'm not punking out, right? I'm just going to back off because the police have been, really active in the area. So I think incapacitation is really an important piece of this. But I think the thing to say is, like, this isn't easy, right? Because we've been doing this for a long time. I mean, really, the FBI, what are they doing in the 30s to confront the mafia? They're doing gang takedowns. They're building conspiracy cases, right? That's ultimately how the mafia is dismantled over a period of 50 years. So, this isn't new, but I think it's just hard to do well. But I think New York figured out a way to do it well. And they figured out a way to do something that was even more effective. And I think much more effective than what they were doing previously, which was to focus on the hot places, but to be very arbitrary within that focus, to focus on all people in the hot places rather than the really pivotal people in the hot places.